So thank you for joining us today. This is our panel on institutions, movements and social rights. Just a quick heads up, I had a baby quite recently who's asleep next to me. So if you hear any crying and I have to get up, that's because I'm looking after a baby and trying to multitask at the same time. So I appreciate that. Right, so today we have three wonderful speakers. Saudi García, Michelle Bueno Vásquez, and Kristina Medina. But I'm very sorry, don't have your last name here. Sorry, and Kristina Medina Vilariño. I'm very sorry about that. So first of all, I'm just going to introduce each. Before each speaker starts, I'll just read off their bio. Could I ask each speaker to keep to 15 minutes, 20 absolute max, because I'd really like some time for questions. If you have any questions along the way, please put them in the chat. But also please feel free to stick a thumbs up at the end and we'll get you on the camera asking your questions, because it's nice to engage with the rest of the speakers. So first up then, we have Saudi García, who is a PhD student at New York University. And also the facilitator for the Peace and Reconciliation Organization in Cultured Company. She's a writer and a documentary filmmaker as well. Saudi uses her skills to create equity, peace and resource access for Afro-diasporic people. She's a medical anthropologist and a political ecologist. And her current project examines gold mining and looks at how pollution is connected to human health and ecological impact in Pueblo Viejo. She's researching the racialized nature of 21st century island economic development, looking at networks of care that make rural Black life possible in the wake of increasing extractivism across the Caribbean region. And her work has been supported by a plethora of fellowships for young researchers. She's also written for a number of publications so you can check her out at Small Acts, the Latinx Project, La Galería magazine, and others. So Saudi is her presentation today is entitled In Cultured Company, Decolonization and Building the Dominicanidad of Tomorrow, Lessons from the Event Lines of Public Scholarship and Activism.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. I apologize, I can't seem to get my my camera to work on Zoom, so you won't be able to see me as I talk, but I do have a presentation that I wanted to share. Let's see. I think I have to reconfigure my Zoom. I'm so sorry, I had to fix some things here with Zoom. So let me try to fix them because it's not quite letting me do what I want to do. Actually, is it okay if I go second after someone goes first, so I can just correct any of these issues with Zoom?
Of course, that's absolutely
Is that okay?
fine. We have
I'm
a
so
technician
sorry.
as well on the line who you can chat to and who can help you.
Okay, that's fine. I think I just have to log out, log in with my Zoom ID, and I think I'll be okay.
Okay, Michelle, are you there?
Hi there, yes.
Hi, fantastic. Okay, right, let me just present Michelle then. Michelle Bueno Vasquez is a second-year political science PhD student at Northwestern University. She graduated from the University of Chicago with special honors in political science and with a focus on studying effects of stereotype threats on Black high school students' political attitudes. Michelle studies American and comparative politics and focuses on race and identity formation in Afro-Latino communities. And she's currently researching how transnational information flows can mutate ideas of race throughout the Dominican diaspora, particularly between the US and the DR. She hopes to pursue a dissertation that explores political and social movements and their implications for Afro-Latino identity that exist on the margin of the US and their impact on Black and Latino coalition building. So yes, Michelle, could you if you could share your screen, then we'll get started.
Sounds good. Give me 1 second to start.
Thank you. And just very quickly, I realized I forgot to introduce myself as well. So I'm Ph.D. Kalaf. I'm currently based at the University of Liverpool in the UK. And yeah, and my research, just a quick plug, my book is out in April, and I look at a concept called legal identity, and I look at basically World Bank, IMF policy and how that's impacted questions of race and belonging, and particularly access to citizenship in the Dominican Republic. Take it away, Michelle.
Thank you so much. Let me start sharing my screen. I have a presentation for you all. Hi. So as was mentioned, thank you so much, Eve. My name is Michelle Bueno Vásquez, and I'm a PhD student at Northwestern University in Evanston, and I live in Chicago. And I grew up in the Dominican Republic, which has initiated a lot of my intellectual pursuits. And I'm presenting today a paper on transnational Black consciousness raising through social media from the US to the Dominican Republic. So a quick introduction. In the year of 2020, we saw on May 25th, George Floyd was murdered at the hands of Minneapolis police, an event that came in the midst of other instances of unarmed Black individuals being murdered by police. This event then sparked multiple protests, not only for George Floyd, but also for Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and many other individuals that came before and after this event. But what was interesting about 2020 was that the Black Lives Matter movement spread from the US and had an international audience through social media. Which is why I say that globalization and protests against anti-Blackness go together. The rise of the Black Lives Matter movement this summer led to the solidification of Black Lives Matter as an ideology against anti-Blackness and against racism. And this international spread through social media led to its adaptation to what I call a transnational racial ideology. And BLM spread to the Dominican Republic is an ideal case study for this concept. So a quick theory of transnational racial ideologies, or what I will call TRIs. So this is a concept that I have created myself. And I here have a glossary where you can see other terms that are related to this concept. So we have ideologies, which are frameworks of idea that organize sets of individuals and social political attitudes. These can be a collection of attitudes that can organize how people think and help individuals soar into social cleavages of like-minded people. Ideologies can also result in social movements, and social movements start due to some kind of instigating event, which I'll talk about it very soon. And these events can lead to protests that claim to work towards a concrete or common cause or direct policy change. And here I have some examples. We have seen the Arab Spring, the abolitionist movement, anti-apartheid in South Africa, and the Black Lives Matter movement specifically in 2014, seeking the not retribution, but rather justice for the murders of unarmed Black individuals at the time, Mike Brown specifically. A transnational ideology is a framework of ideas that originated in one national setting, and then after undergoing a process of informational flow and transnational adaptation, is transcended from its original context to new local contexts. And they can be universalizable and applicable to multiple contexts. So here I noted capitalism, gender equality, and queerness, for example. And that finally takes me to a transnational racial ideology, which is a transnational ideology regarding race. And it can be applied, it applies the original conceptualization of race in the country where the social movement started, while not necessarily erasing pre-existing notions of race in a secondary country. And these could promote racial justice, equality, or anti-racism, again, not necessarily tied to the one instigating event. And examples are anti-Blackness is a transnational racial ideology that we have seen since colonialism, but the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 became another transnational racial ideology, as we'll discuss soon. And here I have a quick causal assessment of the causal framework that I envision in this model. So we have a racially discriminatory instigating event occurring. In this case, say the murder of George Floyd in 2020. Certain explanatory variables that lead to the outcome of a TRI. We have the visibility of the event, whether there were bystanders, whether it was recorded, whether it received a lot of action in the news and the media. Whether a social movement then ensues that tackles the issues of racism or racial discrimination. The use of a platform that can transcend borders, namely social media. and that the core idea of the movement is universalizable, as we see the idea of racial justice and anti-discrimination, even though the core idea of the movement of Black Lives Matter was anti-police brutality in the United States, it has spread to become about racial justice. And finally, that the topic is discussed in social media in multiple languages. And we have really important mediating variables here. We have opinion leaders that provide a platform for the messaging. So people who are very popular and have great followings on social media, the amount of people then sharing the information, and diasporic community sharing the messaging. And then we see new hashtags emerging in the local language and the topic being discussed in terms of a new local context. And then the outcome variable is the development of a transnational racial ideology that is then measured by the communications exhibiting a framework around racial justice that has developed independent of the original event, yet applying a new idea in racial formation that wasn't original to the secondary country, while not erasing those ideas of race in the secondary country. And here I'm going to get to our case selection. So why study this in the Dominican Republic? It's interesting to study anti-Blackness and a transnational racial ideology for pro-equality and anti-Blackness and against anti-Blackness in the Dominican Republic, given that one, the Dominican Republic is a Black majority country where a politicized history of anti-Blackness from the triangle slave trade to Trujillismo and beyond colorism. And when I say beyond colorism, I mean that individuals of different colors in Dominican Republic still feel this claim to Dominicanidad, that we have escaped the bounds of color to be one people. And that is the idea that Trujillo, and even before Trujillo, that during the US occupations, which I'll get to soon, established in Dominican Republic, this idea that nationhood supersedes race, and that's Dominicanidad here. Second, we see a proximity in physical distance and economic interest to the US sphere of influence. And here's where the US occupations become important, in that the US occupations then led to an establishment of a US idea of race in which there is a racial hierarchy and there's an importance to reject Blackness. And in this case, reject Haitianness. And Dominicanidad then becomes this reproduced idea of race where being Dominican becomes not being Haitian, not being Black. And again, third, that in the Dominican Republic, we have this racism without race, a racialized colorist order under Dominicanidad, where everyone's equally Dominican, not everyone has equal access to this Dominicanness. Here I have an example of how the information flows then spread from the US-based event to the Dominican Republic. So the first step is that instigating event. We have a high visibility, especially socially aberrant event that occurs in the US. For example, the murders of unarmed Black people such as Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, and most recently Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Excuse me, I misspelled Ahmaud's name there. And then the second step is that information flows begin. The event receives a rise in news coverage, which subsequently leads to opinion leaders and prosumers sharing the event. And opinion leaders are people with large social media following. Ideological rhetoric then begins in this stage. So Black Lives Matter starts becoming an ideology of racial justice with a high profile view where people are likely to consume and share media and discuss it outside of social media, but again, it's measurable on social media. And then the third step is that transnational reach is likely. So event hashtags and tweets start trending on Twitter, and it becomes very likely that people in other national contexts are exposed to this messaging. Finally, the transnational reach is confirmed. And again, the time difference between step 3 and 4 is it's almost infinitesimal, because once it's out on social media, it's very likely that it has reached international lens, but it can be confirmed once people in other countries start sharing the messaging. And then finally, we have transnational ideological adaptations. So individuals of the secondary country begin engaging in the US ideology with the local status quo and applying this Black consciousness to their local events and to what's going on in their country. So the similarities between the US event and local phenomena are identified. Language around race in the US is adopted to Dominican Republic, talking about Black Afro-descendants. And then we see the hashtags being translated. The hashtag Las Vidas Negras Importan. And we see a very specific Dominican-centric hashtag, Pero no somos racistas. And finally, we have diasporic ideological exchange, which can happen at the same time as this transnational ideological adaptation, where a diasporic sentiment is activated as the diasporic community engages in these conversations. And again, we have information flows coming from the US to DR, from the US between DR, and then from DR to the US, where we have this communication among the diaspora, which is very, very important. And now to talk about my data. Here, I studied a sample of 500 tweets containing the hashtag Pero no somos racistas. They were mined and analyzed using qualitative data coding and in-depth reading. And just a quick look at the data. So we saw some discussions regarding the need for a conversation around race and racism within the Dominican diaspora. Here are some examples of those tweets. In conclusion, these tweets show how many individuals are seeing a relevance to the Black Lives Matter messaging in the Dominican Republic, and even link it back to the Trujillato, to the Dominican anti-Blackness. Then we see people utilizing this hashtag as a social movement as a call for action around specific racially charged events, which was a protest in El Parque de la Independencia, where 2 students were arrested by police for peacefully protesting. And finally, we see mostly anecdotes detailing the specific brand of Dominican inter-community colorism and Black denial. We see colorism regarding hair texture, regarding skin color, regarding ideas of professionalism, regarding denial of Black roots, and this idea of cleansing the race. And then we also see a Dominican context specific discussions around anti-Haitian sentiment, and acknowledging that this anti-Haitianism is rooted in anti-Blackness, even though it's shrouded by nationalism. And what this can tell us is that the concept of transnational racial ideologies, it's important for understanding Black consciousness and how it can transcend borders and impact changes in racialization in countries where this racialization was established around the times of colonialism. And it's important to study this because we can see how ideas of race can change due to diasporic communities. We always hear this idea that immigrants come to the United States or other countries with ideas about they come here with these ideas and then they apply them into this new context. But we rarely hear how these ideas are then translated back to their home countries. And that's why transnational racial ideologies are an important topic of study. And in the era of social media, the impact of diasporic community and social networks cannot be ignored within studies of race and ethnicities. And finally, it's important to see how online platforms are slowly becoming the new oral histories. They're becoming these spaces to communicate individual experiences, to forge social movements, and importantly, as a space to heal these societal ills such as anti-Blackness and racism. These are my references, and yeah, I'm open to any questions. I'm not sure how to moderate this. If you can lend me a hand, Eve.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Michelle. We'll take all the questions at the end, but please start, if you want to start writing them in the chat or thinking about what you want to say, then we'll definitely leave space at the end for that. And thank you for keeping to time. That was fantastic. Okay, so next we've got Saudi Garcia. We're having slight technical issues, so I am going to share my screen. It's saying, oh, there we go. Right, so I'm just going to share her presentation. Can everybody see that?
Thank you so much.
Up? Right, fantastic. So welcome, Saudi, please continue. You have 15 minutes, thank you.
Thank you so much, I appreciate the support. I recently reformatted my computer and my settings seem to be a little bit off, but I'll go ahead and start. By way of introduction, I'll say my name is Saudi. I have been a facilitator within Cultured Company since 2018. And I'll tell a little bit of the way that I will flow with this presentation. It's very narrative and storytelling based because this is the activism and the public scholarship work that I do. And so we'll flow through some explanation and some narrative about Encultured Company. And then I'm going to dive more deeply into 4 of the lessons that I've found that have been emerging from doing this work with community. So in late August of 2018, I was invited to participate in an experiment, an innovative space bringing together Dominicans and Haitians in person in the diaspora to have conversations and encounters. I was excited to have the possibility to have this deep level of offline engagement, the kind that can result in the birth of new social movements and the creation of authentic relationships to counter the psychic power of generations of anti-Haitian hate and fear among Dominicans. So in telling the story of her idea for the creation of Uncultured Company, the founder, Francois, she explains that she noticed curiosity among Dominicans about Haiti, a curiosity that was expressed in hushed, almost taboo tones. She eventually realized that because of the Dominican Republic's economic and political interests, the same ones that orchestrated the genocide in 1937, Dominicans and Haitians may never get a state-led solution for the current conditions of inequality on the island. However, France thought people-centered, people-led solutions could be activated. So in culture,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you just tell me when to change the slides, please?
Absolutely, yes, of course.
Okay,
no problem.
Just tell me when if I'm on the wrong slide. Thanks.
No problem, that's fine. So Uncultured Company is unique in that it brings Dominicans and Haitians together in order to learn our history, undo the damage of nationalist historical narratives, and imagine potential solutions to pressing contemporary problems. More than a year into, please change the slide, thank you. Great. More than a year into our process, we have held 3 separate workshops and 1 community fundraiser. Our first workshop was held at New Women's Space, a radical feminist collective with 60 participants. Our second workshop was held in the First Spanish United Methodist Church in Harlem, actually El Barrio. And our third workshop was held in this space in Brooklyn. So we've also hosted a fundraiser at a Haitian restaurant in Brooklyn, a public education series with Dominican and Haitian scholars. Dr. Silvio Torres Sayant was one of the scholars who we had in that series. And we also sustain an active social media presence with 17,000 Instagram followers, and also a presence on Twitter and Instagram that provides public education crafted by interns who are scholars who come and do our posts. So we found that while online engagement is vital, being in the live workshops and sharing space with our island peers is a magical and necessary experience. Each of our workshops has been dynamic and yet structured around a similar formula. We gain an understanding of the island's complex history. We learn about present-day consequences of allowing white supremacy to run rampant in the Dominican Republic. And we learn about the nature of historical trauma, our island's Afro-derived spiritual traditions, and the way that we can begin to experience more healing in our bodies, in our relationships, and within ourselves. Above all, we create a safe space for complex feelings, a space of resonance, joy, and connection. We usually have small groups. If our Dominican participants don't remember a single historical date, what matters for us is that they walk away from this space experiencing deeper self-awareness, empathy, connection with humans, with the people who they've encountered. And so while ICC does not hold all the answers for how to move beyond violence and continued oppression, what I have found, and which I have written up in a paper that will be published next year in the Border of Lights anthology, are some lessons for moving forward in a different direction, a future of reconciliation and greater solidarity. So please change the slide. These are just a few photos from our workshops, doing some breathing exercises. Next slide as well. These are some of the smaller groups that we host. Next slide. And so here's to thinking of 4 of the lessons that I have learned from my experience doing this activism work, doing this public scholarship work, primarily in New York. So the first is a reinvigorated and critical understanding of the meaning, historical narrative, and nationalist myth-making in the Dominican Republic. And so while it can be argued that the Dominican Republic did not have formalized systems of apartheid and Jim Crow, contemporary socioeconomic inequality, denationalization, and acts of violence against Haitian migrants and their children, as well as dark-skinned Dominicans, in particular police brutality in urban neighborhoods, constitute similar forms of oppression that need immediate addressing. More than improving relations between Dominicans and Haitians, undertaking this peace work as labor is focused on the process rather than just the results, can build new Dominicanidad that is less grounded on anti-Blackness, anti-poor, and discriminatory attitudes. And so some of the work that we do and that we take very seriously within Cultured Company is a process of refining our public education workshops, a workshop that we call Decolonizing Hispaniola. So over the years, we spent considerable amounts of time on this presentation. It's like the center of what we do in these workshops. And so the work of this presentation is really challenging the revisionism, myth-making, and increasingly disinformation on social media that has created Dominican histories that do not reflect the complexity, vibrancy, and importance of the relationship between Dominicans and Haitians. We want participants to understand that Dominican history has been told through the victors. In other words, the people who refuse to acknowledge acts of violence. Through close readings of texts like The Borders of Dominicanidad by Lord García Peña, We Dream Together by Ann Eller, Bordering the Nation, Edward Paulino's book, and others, also texts from the Haitian scholarship, we offer a way to approach Dominican history in ways that center Black transnational solidarity, possibility, and significantly different forms of cultural identification. And through our public platform on social media, we tackle some myths and misconceptions about our island's shared history. Some of those prominent myths include there was no slavery on the eastern side of Hispaniola, Haitians enslaved Dominicans, El Degüello de Moca was a massacre in which Haitians killed hundreds of Dominicans, and other kinds of myth making. We recognize that there isn't a New York City-based movement to bring Dominican studies into high schools, and at the college level, there are limitations to the number of Dominican studies courses that are offered each year. And so this platform serves as a way to bring that public education into our communities. Next slide, please. The second lesson that I've learned from doing this work in community is the necessity to undergo a process of reforming the depth of feeling among Dominicans as we confront some of the more challenging parts of the history. So while undergoing the social labor of facilitating peace and reconciliation between Dominicans and Haitians, I began to notice, and also while doing my field work in Dominican Republic, I have lived here for a year now, I began to notice how neoliberal capitalism, lack of engagement with social histories of fascist trauma have fostered a sense of individualism, competition, and isolation in the island. And so when politicians fan the flames of anti-Haitianismo to create a sense of panic and scarcity, they do so to mask the inequality at the center of the country's model of governance and economic development. And so at the same time, the international public image of Dominicans is completely dissociated often from the lived realities of the fierce struggle for survival and the perpetuation of white neoliberal Eurocentric elite status quo. The nation is instead portrayed as a space of friendliness, openness, and cooperation. And while those images may be accurate, such portrayals ignore how decades of privatization have left many Dominicans numb and struggling to survive, while also silently benefiting from the labor and economic contributions of Haitian immigrants. So the work that I suggest is, in order to bring about a scenario of reconciliation, it's vital that we address these sort of more deep aspects of the ways that oppression has played out. So in a future of reconciliation, I ask, what can formerly oppressive populations abundantly offer if we're not doing the labor of regenerating these negative dynamics within our own cultures, communities, and psyches? And here I want to bring up the experience of peace and reconciliation in South Africa. That is a model that I have taken in crafting this paper and thinking about my reflections. Timothy Muriti in 2006 wrote that a key step to find reconciliation was for members of these communities to re-inform themselves with a cultural logic that emphasizes sharing and an equitable resource distribution. This cultural logic in this context was Ubuntu, a sense that my person, dignity, and well-being and humanity are all inextricably tied to those of the people around me. And so it would be inappropriate to simply take the Ubuntu concept from that South African context and apply it to Dominican society. We have our own terminology, our own ways of thinking about mutual aid and cooperation. For example, there's convitismo, which is a term derived from the word convite, or the communal work parties in rural communities. So our version of Ubuntu is meant to reinform Dominicanidad and align it with ethics of community and care. And so after learning an alternative history of the island of Hispaniola, our hope is that participants are able to enter into a deepened sense of community with each other. We encourage people to exchange numbers, stay in touch, and be actively engaged on our social media platform. This level of cultural realignment towards collectivity is necessary to move toward a process of apology, reconciliation, and reparation. Next slide, please. The third lesson that I've learned from doing this work with Haitian and Dominican attendees and also our online community is there's a necessity to reimagine and rethink what care means for our communities. I use the word care not in an emotional and undefined way. I understand care as necessarily grounded in service and in action, both of which get to be joyful and empowered. I follow renowned cultural shifter Adrienne Marie Brown, a Black feminist scholar, in which when she says that there's a belief that the individual body reflects the social body, which means that our personal transformations can have momentous consequences when scaled up at the level of community. Therefore, the positive personal shifts occurring among the members of Enculture Company's community to regenerate a sense of shared humanity and connection resonate on a larger level and a larger scale. And so, for example, in the winter of 2019, Enculture Company had a chance to glimpse these acts of care in practice. On February 27th, we launched our first social media campaign, the hashtag Real Dominicans Are Not Anti-Haitian. One photo inspired 600 posts, and now it's in more than 1,000 posts and reposts and conversations that were spanning 3 languages, the Caribbean and the US. And this really speaks well to the presentation that was just completed about social media as a tool for amplifying anti-racist ideology. And so these posts were making clear a desire to tell a different story about Dominican-Haitian relations. And so now they're archived online as an assortment of images and commentaries and photos of Dominicans and Haitians in deeper relationship, parents holding their children, partners holding each other, and friends expressing more solidarity and joy. And so through this experience, care and belonging were presented in ways that were transgressive and necessary. Returning to the term Ubuntu, it's crucial to understand the interpersonal solutions are only a piece of what it might take for Dominicans to enter into relation with our Haitian peers. Another aspect of this online work has been that protecting ourselves from the backlash against this work while we form systemic solutions to denationalization and lack of social mobility has become central to our work. I won't go into details of that, but there is an active right-wing presence on social media that's targeting activists. And I believe someone is presenting at the conference about that. Next slide, please. Great. So the final.
Just quickly, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, excellent. I will wrap up. And so the final lesson that I learned, or I'm learning through this process of working with Uncultured Company, is the necessity of forming a complex apology and reparations program led by Dominicans. And so after recognizing ourselves as part of a group that is a perpetrator of violence, historical violence, the responsibility of Dominicans is to lead efforts for formal and complex apologies. These apologies are complex in that they acknowledge the harm that is both historical and ongoing. And so I won't go into detail of how this process happened in apartheid South Africa, but there are lessons to be learned from that experience. And so by way of conclusion, I want to recall a story and a moment that I experienced during the 2019 Border of Lights Vigil in Dajabon, which was led by a host of organizers. And so we held this beautiful mass. It was a bilingual, binational mass. And we wanted to walk to the Massacred River to honor those who had been murdered. But we were cordoned off. We were told that we could not go to the river for our safety. And we were very forcefully told to just vacate the area and leave the premises. And so the crowd dispersed, and a few of the organizers, myself included, we carried a paper box with a candle to the riverside. We wanted to get as close as we could. And so this border guard told us that we could not go to the water, that he was following orders, that if his boss saw any light, he would get in trouble. And so this really made me think about the ways in which fascism and racism play off each other in this necessity of following orders for the sake of keeping peace and structure. El Jefe Trujillo, that's how he would have wanted it. Militarized society where men in boots and uniforms force feed us spoonfuls of violence and call it order. And so regardless of that refusal, we still were able to leave our flowers at the riverside. And in this moment of rebellion, I recognize the necessity of unapologetically rebelling against some of the ideologies and historical narratives and even forms of sentiment that have developed between Dominicans and Haitians. And so I will conclude with that by saying that this kind of small rebellion, whether it's posting on social media or attending a workshop or having difficult conversations with families, those are the whispers of our Loas and our ancestors spilling over with hope and possibility, especially when we begin to tell the full story of the island from a place of empowerment, empathy, and with our eyes toward possible futures. Thank you so much for your listening, and I look forward to eventually sharing the publication of this essay in the joint volume. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Saudi, for that fantastic presentation, and also to Michelle for taking over last minute and taking her place. So next, let me just pull up the screen because I've had to share my files. Next up, we have Kristina Medina-Vilariño, who is the founder of the Caribbean Studies Network and also Associate Professor of Spanish and Director of the American Conversations Program at St. Olaf College. She specializes on Hispanic Caribbean cultural studies, literature and film, and other main areas of her research include Latinx studies and Latin American literature and cultures. In her work, she approaches topics related to transnationalism and migration studies, gender and sexuality, national identity, and racial theory. So please, I can see that you shared your screen, so can you please begin when you're ready? Thank you.
Of course, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening. I'm not sure where you are. Thanks for staying here. And I think, so again, first of all, thank you for those who put together this panel, because I think the presentations could not go together better than they do. The transition is just extremely smooth, so that's great. And my presentation will be a little bit more informal. I want to talk about a platform CaribbeanStudiesNetwork.org, which is what we're looking at here. But I'm not gonna bore you by going, opening every tab. I just basically showing you what you can see by yourself. I just want to provide a general introduction of what this is and what it does for Dominican studies. What can you find there? What's the motivation and where are we heading with this and why we need collaborators? So I guess I'll start with the same thing where I want to end too, which is by inviting you to use it and be part of it. If you explore the different parts in it, you'll see that there's many ways to collaborate. It's a collaborative project, most of all. So what we have here in Caribbean Studies Network, it's basically an archive of knowledge about the Caribbean. But the main idea of Caribbean Studies Network is not to just serve as a depository of information, but to also decolonize knowledge and how we get to talk about the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic, the Dominican diaspora, and its connections. And so I just want to start with a general explanation of what it is. And this started, maybe the webpage as you see it right now, it started in 2018, the summer, so not too long ago. And it came from a group that we already had existing since I think 2012 or so on Facebook. And I think at this point we have about 1,600 people in the group right now from all kinds of disciplines. And the project as an idea initiated with Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean in general. It was born out of a research from the American Council for Land Societies, ACLS, in Puerto Rico. I was doing research on the impact of Hurricane Maria there, and I realized that the story that had to be told was the one about communities and how communities are really moving themselves forward in disasters, in natural disasters, not so natural disasters, and to heal historical trauma, to heal social conflict. And I think the presentations that we saw today are just the perfect example of what that is and how it's happening on the ground. So what we wanted to do was not basically a substitute for a library or a Caribbean Google. We want to present something more organic, but also more inclusive. And when I say we, I began working with this project on my own, but then we worked with several undergraduate students here at Olaf College. So we worked over the summer with about 3 students was the first team, then 2, and then 3, or actually 4 last time. You can see everyone that has worked with me there. And we connected with community partners to expand our offer in connections, making connections, creating digital archives for events that were crucial and that were just basically changing the history of our communities. So I want to walk you through the methodology. I'm not going to read it all. We got all these videos. It's a very easy to navigate platform. We got our methodology, then our theory. And because I know that we have people right now, I think most of us here are academics, but not all of us are. 1 second, I forgot to put my timer. So we are trying to get together people that are working in the community from grassroots organizations, people who are leaders in their communities, and academics that are working on topics related to the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and also not only the island Caribbean, but also the continental Caribbean. Because our team and our resources have not been like huge in the first couple of years, we're still beginning with this project. It's just been basically 2 years now, I think about 3 years now, where obviously I haven't been working 24/7 on this. We're a small team, but what we're looking for is to access and present a kaleidoscope of narratives. We want to highlight popular and academic knowledge in a balanced way. We want to highlight artistic expressions and first-hand accounts, and we want to disseminate these resources to all communities. So if we have a researcher that is working, let's say on Haiti-Dominican relations now at this point, where is that? So how do you do that if you're working on that from the US in any way? Let's say that you're working not only on just academic research, let's say that you're working on a nonprofit and you want to see what's happening there, and who should you contact for your organization? Well, how do you do that when you don't have the contacts, when you're not there? So we want to establish a place where that transition and that bridge can be very organic. You know, that you can come here and you may be able to find things that you would not necessarily find in a library. So that includes archives of hashtags, for example, because just to take an example that's not necessarily from the Dominican Republic, but from Puerto Rico, when we first started this, the main issue was Hurricane Maria. Then the next year was the protest in Puerto Rico. And a lot of that information was accumulating, just like we see with Las Vidas Negras Importan. It was accumulating in social media through hashtags, but those they're gonna disappear fast as soon as they start, piling up. And then what do you do with that? That's just knowledge that you cannot necessarily find in a book because it's happening at the moment. So we have created, and I'm gonna take you to our directory. These are some of the people that have worked with us. These are some of the projects. I'm gonna talk about that in a minute. So we have some projects that we have created specifically on specific themes. These were done by students, several Latin American and Caribbean students, but we also have in eCaribbean 2.0, which is the second version of what we first started, an archive. And let's say that you can look for example, projects, all our projects and all our information that's archived, and will take you to several resources that have been accumulated under a specific hashtag. So you can do that, but you can also find academic resources. And then students, and I think this is some of the most exciting part, have also, and I'm working on expanding this right now, to just show you an example of what has been done that I think speaks to the transnational racial identities. This project was done by a student in last summer in Chicago during the George Floyd protests. And we were noticing as we were working together, she was noticing that the community was just very divided because of this. So the Latino community there from different ethnic backgrounds, and the Afro-American community in there there was just a lot of tension. And so her project documents that, but she also grounds her research on the issues with racial identity within Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, because she's basing her research in a community that is mostly Dominican and Puerto Rican. We also are trying to expand beyond like I said, the island Caribbean. So we're trying to explore, for example, the crisis in the Caribbean in Nicaragua. And one of my favorite projects here, let me go up and I think it's an older project and my screen is smaller, so all right, I think now we're getting somewhere. For example, here. So this project, these are virtual reality projects. I think they present information in ways that it's easy maybe to digest and understand and situate in a urban space. You can literally put like VR sets and it's like you're there, you're navigating in the streets. So this project by one of my students, How do Marginalized Groups React to Oppressive Policies in the Dominican Republic? This is based on the naturalization law. And she basically drafted a map of where the protest had took place, and then information about what happened there. And we also have information. If we click here, we see some of the posters and chants that took place that were related to that protest. So we have information on social media. Let's say, for example, we take this one. So there's that. And you can see that everything is just mapped out. Like I said, you can put VR. If you're in a classroom and you want to teach your students about this is just great because you can put your VR set and you're taking them to these places, to the Dominican Republic. So you have some names about the organizations that organize all of this. So that's one of the projects. We also have other projects that have to do with the identity, of course, but how it's mapped out in urban spaces. So, for example, we got, actually that's the one that we just saw right now. Well, and I'll let you navigate the platform on your own. But basically, that's what we're developing. We also have, like I said, the Facebook group where we exchange more general information. Conferences is way more informal. And what we're looking for in here, we're looking for collaborators. We don't keep your information. We're not copywriting what you give us. We're not owning it. You're just sharing it. It's just a platform to get information out there. So even if it's something that has been published in the past, we invite you to submit it. We are not gonna keep that for ourselves. Let me see what else I wanted to share. Right now, because of we don't have sufficient people working with us, but we're hoping to make it grow more and more, and we're hoping to add more. Right now it's a bilingual platform, but because we're basing this off of a decolonial framework, obviously we want to move beyond the linguistic barriers that were posed by colonial structures, and we're hoping to be able to reach out to people that are willing to add information, for example, in Haiti and the British Caribbean and the Dutch Caribbean, and really expand in a truly decolonial fashion. And I think I'm gonna leave it there, but I wanna invite you to just explore one second, I don't know where okay, let's stop share. To explore the webpage and just look through it carefully, and please contact me if you have any questions at all. Thank you. I'm not sure. Eve, okay, there. I think she left for a second. All right, back now.
I think we lost our moderator. Dr. Torres Celan, you want to chime in?
We can't hear you. It's on mute.
You need to unmute.
So Eve is connecting back. Eve, are you there? I saw the sign that says Eve
She came in and she went out again.
Okay. So the program says that there is one more person. Oh, she's coming back now. Connecting to audio. Connecting to audio. Cross our fingers.
Hi, I have to apologize. My internet has crashed. So, and I just have an echo with my computer. So if Silvio could take over, I would very much appreciate that.
So what is left, Eve?
So we had all our presentations. It's just the question and answers now.
Or just the
Q&A. So we have a good question from. I'm afraid my chat is deleted, but we had a good question from Rachel Quinn. I don't know the question.
Looking kind. Let's see. Hi.
Then I'll see if I can find it.
Would photographers be able to contribute in some way? This came from Jennifer Parra. Hi, would photographers?
I think they're asking for CSN if they're looking for collaborations from photographers, and the answer is absolutely yes. We're looking for, I think, Michelle, I can totally think about a bunch of projects we can do together. Same with, where did she go? Sorry. I'm sorry, Saudi. I can see an excellent project happening with Saudi here. So yes, we're looking for artists, we're looking for photographers, writers, and we can always discuss options. And even if you have done maybe a project with your students or a student that you think it's worth considering or looks like it's fitting this platform, just contact me and we can always figure something out. And it could be something very simple, or we can just develop something a little bit more techy, depends on what you want and how much time you have, and I can pair you up with some students that can help us make it happen.
So I don't see another question, but I could ask one.
Yes, please do.
What I don't hear, what I haven't heard yet, and I like to know because I am generationally invested, yes? I did not see any, I do not understand how these new interventions, how they are conversing or not with previous generations of anti-racist work in the Dominican Republic. You know, going all the way back to the foundational work of Franklin Franco, Carlos Esteban Deve, the people who actually excavated, you know, the history of Dominican Maroons, you know, Maroons in Spanish-speaking, the Spanish-speaking portion of Hispaniola, first in Hispaniola period, right? And then once after in the 17th century when the split occurred, yeah, then Maroon societies on both sides of the islands, and so what do we do with that history? Is you know, just to make sure that we are building, that we're not starting from scratch, let's say.
I can definitely speak to that. So the interns who write the posts, they're usually college students. They base their writings on that scholarship. For me, as someone who researched to write the Decolonizing Hispaniola workshop, those texts have also been really important and very foundational for my own analysis generally, and the analysis that I've been able to arrive to. And so I do think that there's definitely a need to even more center that scholarship in the activism and in the online work. I myself have put together a list of scholars from the Nueva Ola movement. I have it on my website, and I'll post it on the chat as well. It's a list, sort of a bibliographic list of anti-racist scholarship, whether it was archival or poetry or more contemporary cultural writings. And that's a list that I'm constantly revising and going back to as I do my own training. But I understand how, for different reasons, that scholarship is not always accessible to folks in the US. Right now, there's an editorial in Santo Domingo that actually republished the works of Aida Cartagena Portalatin, who's a Mocana como yo. She's a very important writer for me. And those texts you can actually get very easily on Amazon. And so I do recognize there's a need to more directly connect to those works. So I will share that list that I have on my website and the list that I mentioned of the works of Aida Cartagena that have been republished.
Okay. I would recommend the translation into English of Los Negros, Los Mulatos y la Nación Dominicana, which was issued, I believe, in 2015. But the book was published in 1967 and has been reprinted and re-edited all the time. This is never gone out of print, and it was a book that actually fell into the hands of regular people, not only at the university, but actually people reading it, and because Franklin was committed to making sure that the text was accessible and that the data was believable and everything, right? So I think that it's important. It's important to make sure that that's there. In fact, I should tell you, in the interest of full disclosure, I wrote Dominican Blackness, and became like a huge thing. But all I did was cite the sources of the generation preceding me in the Dominican Republic. Yeah. So basically, that's how do we move forward, but not starting again all the time.
I absolutely agree with, I think that's an excellent question. And in part, my answer for CSN obviously is a different kind of thing, because it's not one project, is an archive to create this communication precisely. And a lot of the work, and even the theories on colonialism and race and identity that were in which we based the project are also based on that previous work. However, I think that thinking more about how could we make sure that new generations have access to that very important groundwork that got us where we are now. And a platform like CSN could be excellent to create a collection only. And I invite you, Dr. Silvio Torres-Sayan, if you're interested, it could be a collection on, so what is the groundwork? What is some of the groundwork that we need to reconnect with in order to re-examine our new studies, the new ways of looking at, for example, racial relations in the DR and in the diaspora. So maybe a collection only on that would be an excellent way to put that forward, and like maybe refresh people's memories on what has been done in the past, so we don't, like you said, we're not starting all over again every time.
Thank you, Kristina, for that excellent point. I am aware we've only got about 5 more minutes for questions, and I'm very sorry because I got cut off. Any question that was put in the chat, I can't actually read. So if anybody does have, if anyone has put a question in the chat or does want to ask our panelists any question, can you please put your thumb up now? Otherwise, we might continue this very interesting conversation about how to build on the shoulders of giants, really, and continue the great work of many of the scholars that are here in this chat with us today.
So Rachel had a question earlier, and my chat is still intact, so I could read it out loud.
Yeah, please do.
So she had a question for me. She said, "Thank you for sharing this detailed framework and important project. I wonder if you could talk with us about some of the differences you see between hashtags created and promoted by individuals, community groups, and NGOs that have an interest in influencing social movements, and whether you have thought about what turns up in your data about the differences in impact, involvement, and engagement." And to answer that question, I mean, that question it's a big question, but what I think about in terms of the research that I've done on transnational racial ideologies is that, at least for the Dominican Republic, which has, as many of the scholars today discussed, that this idea of Dominicanidad that's so predicated on this anti-Blackness and the erasure of Blackness, that it was almost imperative for the message of Black Lives Matter to be translated into this new hashtag, pero no somos racistas, because that's kind of how Black Lives Matter or this anti-racist agenda can take off in Dominican Republic. It starts first with addressing this denial of Blackness, whereas in the United States, it could start with Black groups saying, well, we matter too. And then whether the groups themselves denied the Blackness wasn't even a question, because the groups, Black groups in the US acknowledged the Blackness, whereas Black groups in Dominican Republic, there's not really that Black social movement like the ones that not as clearly established as Black Lives Matter. Though the work of Saudi García and In Culture Company is doing making great strides to increase education on this topic, we see that in order for community groups and NGOs to have this kind of engagement in Dominican Republic, it's important to then transcend the national boundary and then address how racial inequality functions in Dominican Republic. It's different, right? We have colorism instead of extra group racism. We have intergroup racism. We have a racial hierarchy. And then it begs the question to predicate, then what is race in Dominican Republic? A lot of people in Dominican Republic don't believe in race, believe that we're all Dominicans, and that racial differences are surface level and don't really translate to this lifestyle differences. So back to the question on how community groups and NGOs can then influence social movements, it's important then to address the local context, right? So if you have this idea of racial justice stemming from the US, say it's an NGO from the US, it's important to get on the grounds and maybe access data the way I have. What I did was mining tweets, but this can be done through fieldwork, through interviews, and seeing how people relate to these concepts and try to not just translate them into terms that they understand that relate to them, but integrate them with their ideas. And that's kind of what we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement and the transnational racial ideology that it presents, that we're seeing not just a translation, las vidas negras importan, we're seeing an application and adaptation into this new context of, pero aquí no somos racistas, pero miren esa diferencia, miren el racismo que tenemos en el grupo de dominicanos. And what I mean by that, sorry that I went to Spanish, is that see the racism that we have within our group, see how a nurse won't let the daughter of a Black woman go because she's lighter skinned than her mother and she doesn't believe that her mother could be darker. The discrimination in terms of hair color in the professional sphere, how when jobs are looking for a professional in a bank, the ads feature white women and not Black women. So these kinds of conversations need to be translated into the context.
So Michelle, just to wrap up, in case anybody else has any questions, please do shout now. I'm interested in, I think scholars are increasingly, especially with you know, the COVID crisis, etc., using social media and also digital technologies as a way of informing their research. And I do worry sometimes that, particularly having lived on the island for a long time, seeing kind of there a conflict sometimes in the discourse of you know, between diasporic groups and then the conversations that are taking place at different levels, and then what's happening at the local, and who are kind of finding these platforms and having their voices heard, and how this is being then disseminated. And I do, this is mainly just an interest in how much can we really tell from something if it's gone viral, for example, on social media, or it's become a hashtag, etc. So I think a good example of the nationalist groups. So when they do attack, we know, for example, a lot of them receive money from the government, their supporters, and they're told, you know, go and send out this amount of messages and just bombard people. But how much does that reflect really the reality in terms of how many people are actually having these conversations or thinking about things this way, or yeah, how that discourse is managed? That's something that I think can sometimes, maybe we can be a bit sidelined in it in terms of our own research by thinking, because we've seen it in this platform or in this scenario, that this is how everybody's talking about it or thinking about it, and actually the reality on the ground is very different. I just wondered if you thought about that in terms of your own project.
Yeah, and that's a question, and thank you so much for bringing that up, Dr. Hayes, is that's a question that I ask myself too when doing this research, right? Like, am I looking into a microscope and ignoring the rest of the world? But what's interesting, at least in my study of transnational racial ideologies, and much like you mentioned with nationalist groups, is that this hashtag and this conversation emerged from different points. It's not necessarily a social movement like Black Lives Matter, and as such, it hasn't had the same lifeblood as Black Lives Matter. It hasn't been able to continue into actionable steps, into protests, into an organization. And because of that, it shows that it's how individuals are feeling, and these individual conversations spiking up using the same understanding and sharing this experience almost in a really organized way that at this point, and I looked at a sample of 500 tweets, but there were more, at this point spreads beyond a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that there were over 30 to 50 tweets regarding hair and discrimination on hair. It's not a coincidence that there were about 50 tweets discussing anti-Haitianism, and not just in regards to Haitians, but now the rise in Venezuelans in Dominican Republic and how they're treated differently as immigrants versus Haitian immigrants, and how the Chinese immigrants are treated differently than Haitian immigrants. So this is where the qualitative data coding comes in handy, because it shows that it's a trend rather than just this one person talking about a phenomenon that may not be a phenomenon. And what's interesting is that this combined with works of other scholars on not just the results of the US occupations, but frequent work on the border, the claims for the border in Dominican Republic and anti-Haitian rhetoric, that it fits really well into the historical framework of the Dominican Republic. So of course, in and of itself, like you said, we can't tell whether it's just a random blip in the data, but when looking at the comparative historical analysis of the US relations with Dominican Republic itself, recent events, the work that Saudi has done, the work that Kristina has done, it fits well into the trend of the data. So that's why I'm confident to say that it has become this transnational racial ideology, but has it become a social movement? Has it been able to maintain that kind of energy? That still remains to be seen. And because it's not as organized as Black Lives Matter, it doesn't have this leadership in different cities, etc. Unfortunately, I don't think it's gonna become this big social movement that will result in the kind of actionable policy like Black Lives Matter, but the ideology is still there, which is very hopeful.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that any of our panelists want to say?
Yeah, is it okay if I want to comment on this question, because I understand the difficulty of connecting what's happening in an online space to what's happening beyond it. But I was part of the protest that happened in February, there was the protest against the election canceling that happened. And from that space emerged youth who live in the barrios, right? Well, it may be very challenging to map out racial ideologies in the DR. Socioeconomic discrimination at a spatial level also very closely maps out the forms of racial discrimination in the country. And so these young women who were part of these protests in February felt extremely marginalized by the more upper class, sort of middle class, elite people who emerged as leading that space, right? And kind of auto-determined that they were leading that space. And from that, they have formed a group that is dedicated to addressing the issues of urban communities that are issues that affect predominantly Black people on the island, like dark-skinned Black youth. And all the leadership is Black-skinned dark youth. And so while I understand that the hashtag that we're discussing didn't kind of jump into a social movement per se, organically from the Dominican Republic, social movements are springing. We have Reconocido, which is a social movement that tackles the forms of anti-Haitian systemic discrimination that we have. And now we have this other movement called Barrio Alante that's also emerging to tackle anti-Blackness and police brutality in the Dominican Republic. And so Black Lives Matter as a hashtag and as a movement space, it's sort of in the air, but people are organically themselves forming social movements that are speaking the language that people understand, right? Like you might not be able to speak about racist, discriminatory policies at a state level because the Constitution is written in a particular way, but you can talk about police brutality that tackles predominantly Black youth in urban communities. And so I think there are ways in which things are emerging really organically from what's happening here in the country.
Right, fantastic. I am aware of the time, so I think we'll have to wrap up there, but I just wanted to thank our three panelists, Michelle, Kristina and Saudi, for your fantastic presentations. And I hope we can, and also big thank you to Professor Torres Sajant for participating. And if anybody has any questions, please, I'd encourage you to contact the speakers after this panel and to keep the conversation going, because that was fantastic. So thank you very much. I hope, gracias a todos y todas, and I hope that we can continue our conversations.